Data for Future, episode 20.
If you ever want to learn about data and machine learning, I'm sure Python is a tool that you're familiar with. At least you heard about it. Not only is it a very powerful coding language, it is also very simple to learn. And honestly, it's one of my favorite computing programming language, being that's the only one I know as well. Like anyone who want to learn about Python, I started by taking online courses, try to learn by myself with Udemy, Coursera. But then later, I had this opportunity to take on Python introduction course in my master with Professor Juan Luis Cano, who is here with us today. Just to give you some credits in the background, Juan has a long love affair with Python. He is the founder and former chair of Python Espana Association, which hosted the Python Spain last year in Alicante and had over 800 attendees. He's very active in the Python community, being an active user and contributor to many projects in scientific Python stack, and has published several open source packages. But above all, Juan has been active in teaching Python in the area. Among the public and private institutions he teaches at, he also delivered Python training course for two biggest aeronautical companies in the world, Airbus and Boeing. So today we have the pleasure to have Juan being here with us to introduce us more his journey and his perspective about Python. Officially welcome, Juan.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here.
So to kick off the conversation, would you like to tell us how did you start with Python? What's your journey been like?
Yeah, so I started programming when I was still in high school, doing some non-Python work. Mainly I was learning PHP for doing web development and a language called ActionScript that was powering Flash-based animations and games. So, I already had some exposure to programming in other different technologies, but then I started my studies in aerospace engineering, aeronautical engineering, and the first year we had many courses on basic physics, mechanics, and mathematics and stuff like that. And for me, having tools in the computer to try to visualize what was going on with a math problem or a physics problems was truly essential to really understand the underpinnings of it. So in the first semester, I bought a license of Mathematica, which is a commercial software for mathematical processing. And I was super happy with it. But, it was a student license of a commercial product, so it lasted only 6 months. So next thing I know was that I was Googling for a free alternative to Mathematica. Mm-hmm. And then Python appeared, and the rest is history.
Okay. So you discovered it by yourself, and how did you go about learning about it?
Yeah, so at the beginning, I have to say that it was really frustrating to learn on my own because I had no references around me of people that were learning it or that could teach it to me, apart from one guy that was blogging about it from time to time. Mm-hmm. So my strategy was after learning the basics, try to get as many projects as I could using Python, especially projects from the university. Normally, we were required to do some work with Excel or even MATLAB, Maple, Mathematica, these kind of products. Mm-hmm. So when we got these kind of assignments, I was trying really hard to make them in Python. And at the beginning, I was so very slow. Perhaps it would take me 2 hours to produce 4 lines of code or stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, with time, I got to practice more and more, and I got a little bit more confident with it. And in 2013, I was doing my Erasmus in Italy, and I got this huge project of analyzing some orbits around Venus and some transfers from Mars and etc. for my orbital mechanics course. And I said, okay, I'm going to ditch all this MATLAB thing and I'm going to do it in Python, whatever it takes. So that was like my first real big project in Python, the first big successful project in Python, I would say. And from there, I kept on practicing and I got more and more proficient with it with time. So
by the time you started, were there any other languages you were choosing from, or Python is which you want to do?
Well, yes, I told you, like, I already knew a couple of other languages, even though, like, I was not using them at the time. And, like, in any engineering course, I suppose we were kind of forced to learn lots of different tools in a very short period of time for very specific tasks. So I knew a little bit of MATLAB. We also took a course on Fortran that was not even compulsory back then, and this was like 2010. So we had to choose between Fortran and English, and I took the difficult path, So yeah, that was like the default option for everything that we had to do, either Fortran or MATLAB. But then most of my colleagues were using either Excel for these kind of projects, or I don't know, anything they could find really to get the job done.
So the first time you find Python to be really helpful was actually to automate some Excel tasks.
Yes, in fact, like that was one of the first things I did professionally. So in 2014, 2015, I was doing my internship in Airbus. The job initially was to create a graphical user interface for a software they were using to compute the loads on the back of the aircraft. But I kind of finished it very quickly. So then I started doing some little tasks to help my team. And I found that many of my fellow engineers were doing lots of repetitive work, like moving stuff from one Excel spreadsheet to the other, So I quickly realized that doing some Python scripting would help a lot and also make the process less error prone, So they were mesmerized by the possibilities of the language. And I think since then, they've been trying to always have their interns programming Python one way or another. So
yeah, that's super cool. You're the one who started this whole process.
Yeah, kind of, yes.
That's cool. It reminds me the book, Automating the Boring Stuff with Python. I think for anyone who want to start using Python, but with small, really practical examples and projects, that will be a good reference to check, no?
Yeah, definitely. Also because when people reach out to me and ask, like, what would be my best advice to get to learn Python? Of course, getting to know the basics is essential. Otherwise, you cannot really do anything useful. But you get to a point fairly quickly when you run out of motivation, or you wonder, okay, so now I know the basic structure of the language and how to do an conditional and a for loop and whatever. But now what do I do with it? So trying to get the answer to that question as soon as possible and set yourself some goals and say, okay, so I don't know, I want to download all the material from my online campus from my university, or I want to, I don't know, remind myself some stuff or automate some Excel work that I was doing. So that is a very specific goal that will help learners like stay motivated and also see some real outcome of what you're doing, which I think it makes everything more easy.
Sure. So for anyone who want to start, of course, starting with small projects would be a very good idea. But how do they go about learning about the potential use cases and how to start with Python, if they don't know about anything about coding? Do you have any advice?
Like for me, it was a lot about reading other people's code. So there, when one is working with Python, it's very common to use third-party open source libraries. We can discuss a little bit more about that later on. And so as I was using lots of these libraries, I got used to read the code itself and try to learn some patterns and how things are done and how other developers test their code and so forth. So that was very helpful in my initial stage of learning Python. Even though, of course, I also had to practice a lot. Like I think for the past 10 years, I've been reading Python every single day of my life, probably nonstop, and not even in Christmas holidays. So yeah, like getting to write a lot of code, even if it feels wrong or if it feels that I don't know it could be done in a better way or whatever, it's really important to practice a lot.
I agree. I guess it's also important to make mistakes as well. And then you realize what else you can do.
Yeah.
But I remember during class, I think one of my favorite part is every day you come to class and show us some interesting use cases or some news about Python. And those are really entertaining, but meanwhile, it really intrigues our curiosity. Are there some sources that you always go to check those kind of updates?
Yes, so I get a lot of information from Twitter, for example. Like I follow some Python developers from many different industries, in fact, and I got lots of interesting news from there, and also like from the Python community itself. So the Python Software Foundation, for example, and other organizations that promote the use of Python. I'm not an avid video watcher, but now it's getting more and more trendy for developers to stream. Mm-hmm. So there's more people like streaming the daily work they do, and they communicate some tips and so forth. And so I think that's also interesting. And then there are a few podcasts out there that do like text summaries as well of all the links and the stuff that they discuss, which I think are super cool to discover like weird areas where Python is being used.
Do you have some names that you can drop to us?
Yeah, I think Daily Python, it's one of them.
Okay.
And I have a few others, but the names don't come to mind at the moment. I think I can share them with you later on.
Okay, we'll add them to our show notes later. Then, since we're talking about interesting use cases about Python, do you have some interesting cases on top of your mind to share with the audience?
Yes, and in fact, what I'm loving about the Python language more and more every day is that it's being used in places where it was not supposed to be present some years ago. Like, yeah. and the first one that comes to mind, for example, is microelectronics and that kind of thing. A few years ago, there was a kind of an explosion of like hobby electronics and so forth with the Arduino platform that you might have heard of, which is an open source board that you can program in a language that is very similar to C, but it's very simple. And people were doing like all kind of circuits with lights and sound and I don't know, lots of crazy stuff. And now, fast forward a few years into the present, there's a few platforms that can run Python itself, even if it's a language that's much more high level and that in principle it requires more resources. As electronics boards are getting more and more powerful and cheaper with time, now we reach the point where you can run Python on super tiny boards like MicroPython, CircuitPython, and etc. Of course, there's things like Raspberry Pis as well, which are not exactly like microelectronics because they are proper computers, in fact. So yeah, people are doing all sorts of experiments there, and I think it's great to see how you can get creative with programming, not only, doing some web development or a program that counts primes and so forth, which is perhaps the picture that people have in mind when they hear about programming, right?
Right, yeah.
And then there's one other use case that I love that I discovered last year when I was in the PyCon Namibia. There was this guy that started composing music with Python live. So it was a very interesting approach. It's called live coding. So you have a blank canvas where you start writing some instructions, and instantly those instructions turn into music and sound. And at the same time that you're evolving the script and changing the program, the music and the sound itself evolves in real time. And you can combine it with visuals as well. So there's, again, people doing lots of crazy stuff with that. And I think it's super cool that, I don't know, you can use programming to do any sort of thing, really.
Anything. It's just whatever you can imagine. We can use Python to do it.
Yeah, that's right.
When you were mentioning about composing music, is that backed by some library already, or people are just developing the script from scratch?
Yeah, for every use case that you can imagine, there's at least one and normally a few libraries that you can use to get most of the low-level work done already, so you can focus on the interesting part, so to speak. So for the case of live coding, there's an environment called Foxdot, based on another software called Super Collider, where you already have like some sample sounds and some logic for repetition and etc. So you can directly jump into writing some music. And it works the same for mostly everything. So for example, if you're working with microelectronics, you have some libraries to talk to hardware elements like cameras and LEDs and I don't know, any other stuff. So you don't have to like figure out the communication protocol and so forth, because you most of the times you have commands like turn on, turn off, rotate this stepway motor or something like that. And so always the philosophy is to try to give a layer to the user that is as high level as possible, so people can concentrate in whatever they want to do without dealing about the details.
Yeah. I think that's the beautiful part of being an open source language, that everyone who has some idea can contribute. So everyone can put their creativity into use to create libraries to enable others to do more things even.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of crazy how this has been exploded in the last years. Like, of course, open source is not new, but with the emergence of platforms like GitHub, for example, a few years ago, now it's more easy than ever to publish open source code online and to collaborate with other people.
So how did you get started with contributing to open source? What was your motive behind, and how did you do your first project?
Well, like for me, it came kind of naturally. I don't know exactly how, but I can tell you for sure that when I started learning how to program, before I started learning Python, I had a very thick book of PHP that I was using a lot. But also for more specific stuff and for getting help, I was using lots of online forums, So I was following tutorials made by some random guy that would publish some tips and how to do this and that. So I got used very early to like just look up information online and find it for free. So, and also like I started joining some forums where you could share your work and get feedback and get criticized and etc. And that was also super useful for me. I remember when I was doing my first web development things back in, I don't know, perhaps 2006 or something like that. And I presented a website made all with tables because it helped me like do a layout of the website. And then I presented that in this forum and everybody told me like, no, you don't make websites with tables anymore. Now you have to use CSS and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, wow, I had literally no idea. So getting this exposure from other people was key also to help me learn faster, and get up to speed with the current best practices and so forth. So yeah, and like I started writing some tutorials about how to do some specific stuff with the technologies I was learning as a way of learning themselves as well, So like trying to teach to others as a way to learn yourself, and then like contributing to open source was like the next natural step to that in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Teaching is always the best way to learn. And you were mentioning the forum where you can get your script critiqued and see other people's work as well. Do you still use them?
It's a good question. Well, this forum in particular, it sadly died a few years ago. Like it was focused on a particular technology, which is Flash, that kind of got obsolete because now the web is very different and there's open standards for everything. And, the way we produce content for the web has changed a lot in the past 10 years, 15 years. But yeah, I do still try to reach out to other people to get feedback on my code, although as I have matured myself as a developer, it's getting more and more difficult, of course. And now the way I get the most support and the best feedback to improve even more as a developer is at work. So from my colleagues, I think it's very important to find a place where you can stay motivated in the sense that you can find colleagues that are very technically proficient and also that they're kind and they try to help you and teach you and everything. So in general, try to find a positive atmosphere to grow professionally.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially nowadays, the Python community is growing so fast. Many tasks in the past you need to code yourself. There's constantly new libraries popping up to do the same thing. So staying up to date not only will keep you curious and motivated, it also will save you a lot of time work-wise. And sharing and discovering new materials and libraries are definitely a key part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any other libraries that would you recommend? I remember when we were doing mentoring session with you, you constantly discover new tools. And in terms of working with Excel, you were introducing us some Fly Excel or something like that.
Probably Excel Wings.
Excel Wings, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got pretty excited about Excel Wings a few years ago because I was working for BBVA in the banking part. And the traders and so forth, they were using a lot of Excel, really huge spreadsheets everywhere. And as part of my job, we were trying to reduce the amount of manual work that was being done and also remove some Visual Basic VBA macros that were popping out here and there. And we were replacing all of that with Python using this library, Excel Wings, which is open source. And it was really amazing what we could do with it. So we could do macros and automate Excel workflows and so forth. I wish I knew this when I was in Airbus a few years earlier. And also for data practitioners, of course, there's one must or I should say two, which are pandas for data manipulation, which is what everybody uses for CSV manipulation, interaction with loading data from databases into tables and so forth.
Right.
And the more proficient you get with pandas, the more streamlined your workflows are and the briefer your code is while being more powerful. So I think it's very useful to get used to it. And also, of course, scikit-learn, which is the reference implementation of lots of classical machine learning algorithms. Nothing to do with neural networks and deep learning and so forth. But I think it's good to know the basics, before jumping into deep learning, because running a random forest or a logistic regression is going to be much, much cheaper and faster than trying to implement a neural network, at least with the hardware that we have nowadays, of course.
Yeah, totally.
And lastly, I would like to recommend Plotly as well. There are a million visualization libraries in Python. And there's the classical one is matplotlib that is super useful and produces very crisp plots, static ones. But Plotly for me is one of the most complete in terms of functionality, and also it's natively interactive. So you can produce charts that you can click, you can pan, zoom, and so forth, which I think it's very powerful for visualization and communicating ideas.
Personally, I used to use a lot of Seaborn and Matplot, but nowadays I definitely, because I do visualization for my work and to share the result with people, having interactive graph is so much more convincing and it looks so much more professional than the static graph. So Plotly is definitely some really useful tool. To follow up on that question, when I produce, right now I'm doing some time series forecasting with Python, with the existing libraries, good tools. However, once we produce the outcome, we want to share it with the business owners who don't really have Python installed in their computer. And what's the best way to ship our final product, the prediction or even just a graph with the rest of the company?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And in fact, one would say that this is one of the weak points of Python. And like installing Python in general is kind of a mess. I would like to get this straight for people going out there and trying to install Python. Like if they feel frustrated or that nothing works, they're not alone. So it's happening everywhere in the world. But to ship the code, like there are a few alternatives that you can try. Of course, the simplest one in a way is decoupling all the processing from the presentation. So trying to make a web application out of what you're doing, which makes kind of like the user interface becomes the browser, which is a piece of software that it's everywhere. And nobody cares about where the server is. But the disadvantage of this is that to develop the user interface itself, like you have to learn some web technologies and so forth, which some people might not know. And also, like, you will have to learn different languages than what you can do with Python itself.
So you couldn't do that with Python only?
I mean, kind of yes, but to a limited extent. For example, there's a project that it's called voila, like the French word, that is used for dashboarding. So you can have a Jupyter notebook, and then voila turns that into a web application, removes all the code, and only keeps like the visuals and the widgets and so forth. Okay. So I've tried that in the past with very successful results. But yeah, you're kind of limited of what you can do on the interface side of things. But it might work for some prototypes, you know, so it's good keeping it in mind. And also I've heard of some other library that's called Streamlit. I haven't tried this one myself, but I've heard some very positive things of it.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard of Dash.
Yes, Dash is like the dashboarding solution on top of Plotly, right?
Yes. How have you worked with that?
Yeah, I haven't worked with that. I mean, but being based on Plotly, I would expect it to work very nicely because Plotly makes things so easy. So yeah, we'll definitely give it a try as well.
Yeah, and I remember before when we were doing projects, we also mentioned a Flask.
Yes, so Flask would be like a lower level way of developing a web application. So Dash and voila, Streamlit, they already give you a lot of work done because they make a lot of assumptions. Like voila assumes that you're working with a notebook, and Streamlit assumes its own set of things as well. So with Flask, you have all the tools you need to make a web application from scratch, which can give you a lot of flexibility. But for some other stuff, you need to do more work. And the disadvantage here would be that you don't get automatically like a UI. So you will have to develop it on your own.
I see.
So this would be like the solutions to create a web application. And then I know that there are other solutions to ship this Python code to other computers and making it easier. And I think the most widely used one these days is PyInstaller, which bundles all the dependencies of your code and creates like a zip, a usual installer that you click next, and then you get Python code working in the other computer. So
interesting. That would be very useful for me to test it out. very soon. So we talk about these amazing libraries, and I assume they're all developed by developers from all around the world through this open source platform. Do you want to give us some introduction and a brief view about open source?
Yes, so open source is a global movement of people sharing their code under what we call open source licenses. So there's a very large family of different open source licenses, but most of them fall into two categories. You either share your code, no strings attached, so you only ask for people to like keep attribution on your code. So if they're using it, so you ask them to mention you somewhere. And there are other family of licenses that force you to make whatever you're developing that uses these tools to be freely available as well. So kind of preserving the open nature of the code. So apart from like these legal terms, open source is a way of working. So all these projects have all their code online, and also usually a list of known issues and to-do tasks and so forth. So developers gather there and make small contributions that perhaps they fix some bug that is present in the code, or they develop some new feature, or they just raise a question on whether a particular library could support a new use case and so forth. So it's also a global conversation happening in these platforms about what the code should do and how should it look like and how should it do it and so forth. So it's really a truly open and very participative process that anybody can engage.
And in terms of the platform where people used to collaborate, is it mainly in GitHub?
Yeah, it's GitHub. I would say it's if not the largest, it's probably the most popular platform these days. It's been like that for a while. And also since Microsoft bought it, I think a couple of years ago, if I'm not mistaken, it has grown a lot in terms of new functionalities and better integration with the Microsoft products like VS Code and etc. and so forth. So it's getting better and better with time. And also there are other platforms with slightly different use cases or like a more like political stance towards like having a community platform not controlled by any company. Like for example, like GitLab, for example, which is both a service created by a company, but also an open source project that you can deploy on your own. And also things like Gitea and so forth. So there's like many development platforms like this. But yeah, mostly like at least I would say that most of the Python projects that I interact with, or if not all of them, are developed on GitHub these days.
Okay, so it's definitely some good tool to learn about as well if you want to learn about Python.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I just realized I forgot to introduce you because in terms of profession, you identify yourself more as an aerospace engineer. And actually, for your current job, you work with aerospace and satellites. So it's actually a really cool project that you're working on. And maybe you can indulge us and introduce us a bit how you work with satellites with Python.
Of course. So I work as a mission planning and execution engineer in Satellogic, which is an Argentinian startup creating a constellation of Earth observation satellites. So small satellites that take pictures of the Earth on a continuous fashion. And our idea is to have hundreds of these satellites and be able to take a picture of the whole Earth every day. So it's a pretty ambitious goal to have, but we're working our way towards it. In fact, we're launching one satellite in August and 10 more later on in October, probably. So we're step by step building this constellation. And the cool thing about it is that we're using Python a lot and lots of open source projects as well, both on the ground software, so what we call like everything that happens on Earth, so processing the data, creating the schedule of the satellites, and so forth, and also in orbit. And in fact, one of my main tasks is to develop a Python software that stays in orbit and reads a list of tasks that the satellite has to perform. So like turn on the camera, point towards some target, start shooting, save the frames to a particular directory, queue that so we can download it with the radio and so forth. And all of that is happening with Python. And I think it's super cool.
So it's like, I don't know if you call that process engineering.
Yes, kind of like my self-given title is mission planning and execution engineer, because I take care of the execution, so the part that stays in orbit and reads the tasks, and also the planning. So how do we optimize the few satellites that we have at the moment to capture as much value as we can?
Because I think for most people who got interested and start with Python, they mostly know Python as a tool to do machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence. However, in terms of automation and engineering, it's actually a very good knowledge and tool to have as well.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, well, looking at the latest surveys that the Python Software Foundation is conducting, the data part is growing more and more in Python. And in fact, I would say that it's the area that it's driving the most the growth of the language these days, even though there are other things appearing, like, as I mentioned before, electronics, which is getting stronger every day. And also there's a very ambitious project to be able to use Python to develop mobile applications for Android and iOS that is called Beware, which, if I recall correctly, I think it's mostly ready to use and start developing stuff with it. But yeah, for automation and engineering, it's getting more and more useful. And in fact, many engineering products that, at least in the field of aerospace engineering and so forth, which is the one that I know the most, they support like a Python scripting layer or some Python API that you can use to automate the software and so forth. And this is a trend that it's getting stronger every day as well. So I think it's a great tool to have in any engineer's tool belt for sure.
Yeah, it's super exciting to see the power, the potential of this programming language. And most of all, it's also very accessible. There's a lot of learning resources, and it's not as complicated as any other programming languages, I would say.
Yeah, so like now that we got everyone excited with Python, I would like to use this opportunity to say that we need more people contributing to open source, and especially we need more people that don't look like white guys with white skin, you know? So in general, the technology world has a problem with diversity, and gender diversity is the most obvious one because women are 50% of the population. But according to some surveys, they make around 25% of the people doing technical things on the IT sector. And in the open source world, the statistics are really saddening. So there are some people saying that there's 3% of women in open source or stuff like that, which I think it's a really sad thing to have, and that we should do much better. So there's a lot of initiatives that are going on, especially in recent years, to try to bridge the gap and bring more women into computing, more LGTB folks, more Black people, more Latino people in the case of Spain, for example, even teaching computing skills to refugees and people in risk of social exclusion, so it can help them find a job and so forth. And now that we in the technology world are so privileged that we have good paying jobs, that we can choose to work almost everywhere in the world, that we are definitely the most, the job that is hired the most probably. I think we also have a responsibility to use that position of privilege and try to lift others that need it very much. So yeah, I would like to leave that as a message at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Diversity is something we need to work harder on in terms of this world of technology, coding, and development in the future. Just to wrap up this interview, I would like to ask you a final question. As we see how important it is, the role of coding and technology, do you see programming becoming the modern world literacy somewhere near in the future?
Yes, it's a very good question, and it's a bit conflicting, because what we see, I don't know if it's everywhere in the world, but at least in the Western world, and especially in Spain, is that the education system has fewer resources every year, but at the same time, we want students to have tablets, laptops, touchscreens, to know computing and whatnot. So I think if we want to have the education of the future, we also need to level up and be willing to pay more taxes and fund our schools and have classes with fewer students so teachers can do a better job and so forth. So I think that's out of the way, essential. Otherwise, we cannot really do anything. And regarding the question on whether computing will be the new literacy, I kind of think so, but not in a way that many people think about it. I don't think everybody will have to learn how to program necessarily, but without doubt, we need more technical skills, and we need people that are very comfortable with technology and that that can use any sort of device without getting stuck or anything like that, because the world is getting more and more digital, and we truly need it. Otherwise, many people will be left behind. And I guess understanding how a computer works is kind of part of that. So I see in some ways that learning the basics about how to program will be useful. But I think it would be even more useful to focus more on problem solving skills. Problem solving skills would be my summary, because in the end, programming is applying some weird syntax that looks like English, but it's not quite, and is very unforgiving, as you can know.
Yes.
But in the end, you have to break down a problem and try to translate that into the code that you want to write. And computers will not be able to do that for a very long time. That's a task that's left to humans. And I think we have to be better at it. So
yes, absolutely. So thank you very much for the interview. And last but not least, how can people reach out to you? How can people find you?
So I'm mostly active on LinkedIn. That's the only social network that I manage these days. And I post content about technology and sustainability and ethics in data and stuff like that. So I'm Juan Luis Cano on LinkedIn. Beware, because there are a few Juan Luis Cano in the space industry.
No worries.
And I also have a Twitter account that's called Polyastro, which is only about Python for orbit analysis and space and rockets and so forth. So a bit more specific. And also my email is hello@juanlu.space. So if anybody has questions about any of the things or wants to reach out for whatever reason, I will be happy to have an email chat.
Great, super. We'll link those contact information into our show notes as well.
Excellent.
That wraps our interview episode for today. I hope our dear audience enjoy it. And to support us and to keep the conversation going, feel free to leave us comments and reviews in our Typeform link, which is together with this show note. And also, we would appreciate any additional support. Support us and become our Patreon. That's it for today. Data for Future. We'll see you next time.